It didn't smell like a battlefield. It smelled like a workshop. In a dim hangar outside Hamburg, German engineers crowded around the wreckage laid out beneath harsh floodlights. The Mosquito bomber, captured almost intact after being forced down in a farmer's field, lay disassembled like a strange, defeated animal. Its pale wooden panels looked almost domestic, as if they'd come from a carpentry shop rather than a warplane. They had been told this was the fastest bomber in the British arsenal, capable of outrunning Messerschmitts and F-Focke-Wulfs at full throttle. To the Luftwaffe's engineers, that claim sounded absurd. Wood belonged in museums and old biplanes, not in a modern war driven by jets and high-octane fuel. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, a senior materials specialist from the Luftfahrt Ministerium, pushed his glasses up his nose and tapped one of the panels with his knuckle. The sound wasn't metallic, it was hollow, soft, almost funerary. "It's plywood," he muttered, disbelief threading through his voice. A few technicians snickered. "A wooden bomber," one of them scoffed. "The British must be out of aluminum." They had expected splinters and cheap joints, not an aircraft that had embarrassed German air defenses for nearly 2 years. Outside, rain whispered against the hangar roof. Inside, the air was thick with the sharp, sweet scent of phenolic resin, a mix of varnish and burnt sugar that clung to skin and clothes. The engineers got to work with surgical precision. No rivets, no welds. Every panel was bonded, not fastened. The seams were so perfect they reflected light like polished stone. When Henkel tried prying 2 layers apart with a chisel, the blade snapped cleanly. He frowned. "This isn't carpenter's glue," he said quietly. "Whatever this is, it's stronger than the wood itself." His assistant suggested a type of resin, perhaps bakelite. Henkel shook his head. Bakelite was brittle. This was flexible, heat-resistant, almost organic. Under a magnifying lens, the fibers looked fused like living grain. What unsettled him most was the craftsmanship. Every curve of the fuselage seemed sculpted, not built, shaped with the care of a violin maker. Smooth contours for drag, hidden strength beneath elegance, every layer serving a purpose. As they measured and photographed, something shifted. The mockery faded. The longer they studied the Mosquito, the harder it became to dismiss it. There was a mind behind this machine, one that had anticipated their skepticism. By midnight, the floor was scattered with sketches, wood shavings, and half-finished coffee. Henkel rubbed his temples, surrounded by fragments that rewrote everything he thought he knew. The calculations didn't lie. This toy airplane had reached speeds their best metal bombers couldn't touch. Somehow, wood had beaten steel. Staring at the pale curve of a wing root, he whispered, "How?" The irony gnawed at him. Germany, the home of precision engineering, had been outrun by an aircraft built in furniture factories. Outside, the distant hum of British bombers drifted over the city, a reminder of an empire slowly wearing down. In that hangar, amid the smell of glue and wet timber, the question changed. It was no longer whether the Mosquito worked. It was why, and what secret hid in the glue that made it invincible. In 1938, as the world braced for a new war of steel and armor, one man had presented the British Air Ministry with a proposal that felt almost insulting. Geoffrey de Havilland, tall, calm, quietly unshakable, unrolled blueprints of a bomber that violated every principle of modern military aviation. No defensive guns, no armor, and worst of all, a structure made almost entirely of wood. The officials listened politely at first, waiting for the punchline. When none came, they dismissed the idea immediately. Metal was the future. Wood was a relic. But de Havilland didn't budge. He understood something no spreadsheet could quantify. Speed could replace armor, and simplicity could mean survival. Britain was already running short on aluminum. Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Lancasters were devouring every available sheet. De Havilland saw what others didn't. His company had mastered wooden construction through racing planes and light aircraft. Across Britain, thousands of craftsmen, cabinet makers, piano builders, and carpenters had skills with no place in the metal war. He saw potential where the Air Ministry saw impossibility. What if their hands could build something faster, quieter, and lighter than anything flying? He envisioned a stripped-down bomber with a two-man crew, its frame shaped for speed. Layers of birch plywood bonded to a core of Ecuadorian balsa. Not glamorous materials, but mathematically perfect ones. Birch for strength, balsa for weight, and holding it all together, an adhesive stronger than any rivet. The laminated monocoque technique had been used in furniture long before aircraft. In de Havilland's mind, it wasn't craftsmanship, it was strategy. Every pound saved in armor could be turned into speed. If the Mosquito could outrun fighters, it wouldn't need to fight them at all. When war broke out in 1939, his idea seemed doomed. The Air Ministry wanted metal giants with turrets and gun crews. But war has a way of crushing certainty. By 1940, after France fell and the Blitz ravaged British cities, shortages were so severe that even the impossible suddenly seemed worth reconsidering.
De Havilland returned with a refined prototype concept, insisting that his wooden bomber could be produced in ordinary furniture factories without diverting a single sheet of aluminum from desperately needed Spitfire production. The Air Ministry, still skeptical, reluctantly approved the construction of one prototype. By the autumn of 1940, under dull, gray English skies, the first Mosquito began to take shape. Piano makers from London smoothed the wings to perfection. Violin craftsmen shaped the elegant curved nose. The adhesive that held every seam together came straight from furniture research labs. Phenol formaldehyde resin, a synthetic glue that hardened into something resembling amber. When applied between layers of wood and pressed under heat, it merged them into a single unified material, neither wood nor plastic, but something uniquely strong, light, and resilient. It was an aircraft born from craftsmanship as much as chemistry. On November 25, 1940, the prototype, painted in bright training yellow, rolled onto the runway at Hatfield. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's son, strapped into the cockpit. The twin Merlin engines trembled like caged animals waiting to be released. When the aircraft lifted off, the onlookers expected strain. Instead, it shot forward with effortless grace, climbing faster than any bomber they had ever seen. At altitude, it exceeded 390 miles per hour, faster than the Spitfire Mk1, faster than any fighter in service at the time. The previously silent Air Ministry officials could only whisper in disbelief. A wooden aircraft had just outpaced the best machines of metal. Later that night, de Havilland walked alone through his dim workshop, past unfinished frames glowing under the lamps. He placed his hand on one of the laminated panels and felt the warmth of curing glue. Smooth, warm, alive with potential. He knew then that warfare had just changed. A bomber built from furniture wood had proven that imagination could outrun fear. When the Mosquito finally entered combat, it carried no turrets, no armor, and no illusions. Its survival was dictated entirely by physics. The first squadrons to receive it in 1941 looked at the aircraft with a mixture of amazement and uncertainty. Pilots accustomed to slow, lumbering Blenheims and Wellingtons now faced a bomber that looked more like a sleek racing machine, slender, elegant, and completely unprotected. Only two men flew the aircraft, a pilot and a navigator, seated shoulder to shoulder in a cockpit barely big enough for both. There was no rear gunner to guard their six, no armored plating to shield them from flak. Their manual could be summed up in a single sentence. If intercepted, don't fight. Run. Keep the throttles wide open and trust the Merlin engines. The Air Ministry, once dismissive, had become infatuated with the Mosquito's speed. Official trials at Boscombe Down recorded nearly 400 miles per hour, faster than anything the Luftwaffe could scramble. But statistics were one thing. Survival over enemy territory was another. The Mosquito still needed to prove that pure speed could replace armor. Its trial by fire came on September 20th, 1941, when Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron launched a daylight strike on Oslo. Their task? Hit the Gestapo headquarters and escape before German fighters could react. Skimming just 50 feet above the sea, the wooden bombers sliced through spray and fog. Radar spotted them too late. By the time the alarm reached Luftwaffe command, the Mosquitoes were already racing home. Fighters scrambled from Stavanger but never came close. Witnesses on the ground heard only a ghost-like roar before the aircraft vanished. All planes returned unharmed. Their next challenge was even bolder. In January 1943, a Mosquito reconnaissance flight pierced deep into Berlin's airspace in broad daylight. Sirens wailed across the capital for the first time in months, not because of a massive raid, but because two unarmed bombers were flying faster than any German interceptor. Radar operators watched their blips accelerate beyond anything that could pursue them. When the Mosquitoes dropped their 500-pound bombs, Hermann Göring was in the middle of a meeting. Enraged, he declared the raid a personal insult and ordered every available fighter to chase them down. None succeeded. By 1943, Mosquito crews had learned the aircraft's unique rhythm. At 2,500 feet, it seemed to dance over flak bursts like a leaf on storm winds. The laminated wood absorbed vibrations that would have torn metal skins apart. Even direct hits rarely sparked fires. Without aluminum, the aircraft was less prone to fuel vapor ignition. Pilots said flying it felt almost organic, flexible, forgiving, alive. One crew returning from a raid over Cologne described tracer fire drifting past them like glowing feathers, falling away as if the air itself favored their escape. Its reputation spread quickly. British newspapers called it the Wooden Wonder. German airmen gave it another name, der Teufel aus Holz, the Devil of Wood. Luftwaffe orders soon changed. If a Mosquito is sighted, do not pursue unless conditions are perfect. In level flight, it could not be caught. In a dive, it accelerated beyond the structural limits of German fighters. Legend followed legend. In February 1943, Mosquitoes from No. 105 and 139 squadrons carried out one of the war's most daring precision raids, a daylight strike on Berlin, timed to coincide with a speech by Göring. As he addressed the Reichstag, explosions shook the windows. The timing was so precise that even German propagandists couldn't hide the embarrassment. The unthinkable had occurred. Wooden bombers had struck the heart of Nazi Germany and escaped untouched. The success changed everything.
The Royal Air Force soon began reshaping its operations around the Mosquito's extraordinary mix of speed and stealth. It became the preferred aircraft for photo reconnaissance, precision bombing, and pathfinding. Every mission reinforced a simple rule: the less weight you carried, the faster you flew. And the faster you flew, the better your chances of surviving. The men who flew it gradually came to believe in its legend. They called it the plane that forgot how to die. Across the channel, however, inside the cold, sterile workshops of the Luftwaffe, disbelief hardened into obsession. German command demanded to understand how a plywood aircraft was humiliating their best machines. It wasn't merely a military setback, it was a scientific insult. Somewhere inside those smooth wooden contours, they believed,
lay a secret Germany had to uncover. In the spring of 1943, their chance arrived. A British Mosquito, hammered by flak during a reconnaissance flight over northern Germany, managed to glide for miles before crash landing in a marsh near Hamburg. Against all odds, it didn't burn. When German soldiers reached the wreckage, they didn't find charred metal. They found something that looked strangely like the remains of a shattered boat. Smooth wooden panels, light enough for a man to lift, still carrying the faint scent of resin and smoke. To the Luftwaffe's technical branch, it was a treasure. Orders were issued immediately. Recover everything. Every splinter was to be sent to the secret analysis hangar outside Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's main testing ground. Under harsh white lights, the Mosquito lay on wooden trestles like a patient awaiting dissection. Engineers circled it with scalpels and clipboards, their breath fogging in the frigid air. These were men accustomed to steel frames and rivets, to welds and gauges, not to sandpaper and glue. Their first cuts were cautious, almost medical. Layer by layer, the aircraft revealed its mysteries. The outer skin was birch veneer, only millimeters thick but astonishingly uniform. Beneath it was a honeycomb of balsa, light enough to float yet incredibly stiff. Another layer of birch followed, the entire structure fused so seamlessly it might have been carved from a single living tree. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel led the investigation. An expert in metal fatigue, he had spent his career studying how steel failed. Now he stared at the Mosquito's flawless joints in silence. He muttered, "They've turned carpentry into engineering." His team measured density, tensile strength, shear resistance, and every test defied expectation. The laminated composite could support nearly twice the load of aluminum at half the weight. It resisted heat, vibration, and moisture. When a technician attempted to separate two panels with a hydraulic press, the wood fractured before the adhesive bond even budged. German trainers and gliders used casein glue, a milk-based adhesive. It was cheap and easy to produce, but broke down under humidity or heat. The British glue was different. It seemed immune to everything. Henkel ordered a chemical breakdown. The lab results puzzled everyone. A phenol formaldehyde synthetic resin, catalyzed under pressure. When heated, it didn't soften, it hardened further, becoming a thermosetting polymer that bonded wood fibers at the molecular level. It was, in effect, a kind of synthetic armor hidden inside wood. Henkel's frustration was palpable. Germany's chemical industry, once the envy of the world, had produced synthetic fuels, rubber, and dyes. Yet it had never created anything like this adhesive. The reason was brutally simple: resources. Phenol and methanol were derived from coal, and both were being swallowed by explosives production. Even if Germany had known the formula, they couldn't have produced the glue in meaningful quantities. The discovery sparked equal parts admiration and despair. The Mosquito's brilliance wasn't luck, it was ingenuity born from necessity. Every design choice reflected adaptation. The fuselage was made in two mirrored halves, molded over concrete forms in furniture factories. Once bonded, they created a perfectly smooth shell requiring no internal bracing. Lighter, stronger, and far more aerodynamic than any riveted metal frame. One of Henkel's assistants, a young engineer named Vogel, stared at a wing cross-section beneath a magnifying lens. He whispered, "It looks alive." He wasn't wrong. The glue lines resembled leaf veins. The structure flexed instead of cracking. It absorbed shock, dispersed force, and returned to shape. In a world obsessed with rigidity, the Mosquito had been designed to bend. When Henkel presented his findings to Luftwaffe commanders, the room went silent.
He placed two samples on the table, one aluminum, one laminated birch bonded with British resin. The wooden piece bent and sprang back. The aluminum bent and stayed bent. He said quietly, "Gentlemen, we have been pursuing the wrong kind of strength." But pride dies slowly. Some officers refused to accept that glue could outperform steel. Others demanded a German clone, a fast wooden aircraft to prove the concept. Yet the engineers already knew the truth. They could copy the Mosquito's outline, its dimensions, even its engines. But they couldn't copy its soul, the glue that transformed fragile wood into a weapon. As they packed the samples for Berlin, the scent of British resin still hung in the hangar, sharp and sweet. Henkel lingered a moment longer, running his gloved hand over the shattered wing. He whispered, "They built this in a furniture factory. And we, with all our steel, cannot catch it." Orders soon came down from the top. If Britain could build a wooden bomber that outran every German fighter, then Germany would build one even faster. The project was christened Muka, the net, a name meant to mock its British counterpart. On paper, it was a proud boast. In reality, it marked the beginning of a slow, painful disaster of overconfidence. The first prototypes were handed to a small team at the Luftwaffe Forschungsanstalt in Braunschweig. They started with captured Mosquito drawings and the fragments Henkel's team had catalogued. But even from the outset, the mathematics betrayed them.
The British had relied on lightweight Ecuadorian balsa, an ideal core material, but Germany could no longer obtain it because of Allied blockades. German engineers substituted pine and beech, harder and far heavier. A single wing section that weighed only 280 kilograms on a Mosquito swelled to 410 kilograms on the Muka prototype. The adhesive was another compromise. Without access to phenolic resin, the team reverted to casein glue mixed with formalin in hopes of slowing deterioration. It held well enough in dry conditions, but heat and humidity caused it to soften, a flaw every engineer recognized but none dared admit openly. Still, the Reich's propaganda machine demanded progress. Henkel's warnings about instability were quietly edited before the reports were forwarded to Berlin. Production orders were issued to furniture workshops in Dresden and Kassel, the very same type of factories Britain had used with success. But German workers faced air raids, shortages of materials, and a dwindling pool of skilled labor. The Mosquito had been born from creativity. The Muka was being born from desperation. By late 1943, the first prototype finally stood complete, a pale imitation of the British aircraft. Under the floodlights, it looked deceptively convincing. Twin engines, smooth fuselage, identical lines. But the illusion ended the moment it took to the air. On its maiden flight, test pilot Hermann Ernst Kessler immediately noticed sluggish handling and strange vibrations at high speed. At 350 miles per hour, the wings began to resonate, the laminated structure groaning under strain. Cracks formed along the leading edges within minutes. Kessler pulled back power and attempted a landing, but the weakened structure failed and the undercarriage collapsed on impact. Inspection revealed the truth. Moisture had seeped into the glue joints, weakening them just enough to distort the aerodynamic profile. The adhesive hadn't failed catastrophically, it had failed subtly. In aviation, subtlety was fatal. The second prototype, reinforced with extra bracing and modified glues, performed no better. It flew heavier, slower, and less stable. On paper, it reached 360 miles per hour, faster than a Heinkel H-111, but still 50 miles per hour slower than the Mosquito it was built to chase. The third prototype disintegrated mid-dive during a low-altitude test. The investigators tried to blame pilot error, but the truth was plain. The wooden structure had delaminated in flight, ripping the wing from the airframe. By 1944, the Muka project was effectively dead. What remained were the reports. Thick binders filled with charts, measurements, and something rare in German engineering documents: despair. One senior engineer admitted, "The design cannot achieve parity with British construction due to fundamental material limitations." Another scribbled the line in the margin of a test report: "We are fighting physics with paperwork." Inside the Reich Ministry of Aviation, no one wanted to inform Hermann Göring. His rage over the Mosquito was already infamous. He had boasted to Hitler that the Luftwaffe would retake the skies, yet wooden bombers continued to fly unopposed over Berlin, mocking him with each daylight strike. When Göring finally learned the Muka had been canceled, he hurled the glass ashtray against the wall and roared, "We are being defeated by carpenters!" For German engineers, the humiliation was far deeper than his anger. Germany's identity rested on precision metallurgy and rigid engineering principles, principles that the British had turned upside down. The Mosquito wasn't flawless. It was fearless. It broke rules that German engineering treated as sacred: never trust organic materials, never depend on hand craftsmanship, never tolerate variability. And yet the Mosquito thrived. Its wooden shell flexed where metal would crack. It absorbed vibrations where rivets would tear loose. It survived because it disobeyed the rules. Henkel, who had watched the entire debacle unfold, wrote in his private journal that autumn, "We are trapped by our own logic. We have machines without imagination, and they have imagination without machines." He never shared that line officially. It would have sounded like treason. But among engineers, the sentiment spread silently. Britain had won not through overwhelming industry, but through the courage to defy its own textbooks. As winter settled across the ruins of German cities, mosquitoes continued to appear above the clouds, sleek, silver, ghost-like. Their polished wooden skins caught moonlight like mirrors. Below them, the engineers who had tried to imitate their design stood surrounded by warped wings, cracked fuselages, and the bitter stench of failed glue. The Muka had proven a truth every engineer fears. Copying genius is easy. Understanding it is nearly impossible. By 1944, the Mosquito had evolved beyond just being an aircraft. It had become a presence, something between myth and machine. It drifted through Europe's night skies like a rumor, impossible to track, impossible to intercept. Luftwaffe radar operators dreaded the flickering blip that appeared and vanished too quickly to follow. Fighter pilots called it der Schattenjäger, the shadow hunter. Even German troops on the ground learned to fear its low, haunting whine at dawn. If a mosquito could reach you, it meant nowhere was safe. The statistics told their own story. Heavy bombers like the Lancaster suffered loss rates of 5 to 7% per mission. The Mosquito's loss rate was under 1%. One aircraft lost for every 200 sorties. It meant that Mosquito crews, unlike their comrades in slower, heavily armored bombers, could survive dozens of operations. Pilots joked darkly that flying a Mosquito was safer than crossing Piccadilly after sunset. But beneath the humor lay a remarkable truth. The most survivable aircraft in the Royal Air Force was unarmed. Inside Germany, humiliation deepened with every intelligence report that crossed Göring's desk. He had once assured Hitler that German air superiority was inassailable. Now, British bombers visited Berlin daily, with the Mosquito choosing the most insulting moments to appear.
In January 1943, a Mosquito dropped its bombs on Berlin at the exact moment Göring began a radio broadcast.
In January 1944, it repeated the insult during another high-profile meeting. Both times it slipped away untouched. Göring reportedly fumed, "I turned green with envy every time I see those wooden planes over Berlin." The British can afford to lose pilots, but they don't lose them because they're too fast for our fighters to catch. The bitter truth was simpler and far more painful. The Luftwaffe had aged, while the Mosquito remained young. Germany's experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the new recruits lacked the training required to fight an enemy that refused to follow the old rules. Conventional bombers could be intercepted, predicted, steered into traps. The Mosquito ignored every pattern. It flew alone or in pairs, skimmed treetops, vanished into cloud cover, struck at angles no doctrine anticipated. By the time radar found it, it was already a memory. At Rechlin and Peenemünde, German engineers pushed desperately for faster interceptors, new variants of the FW-190, the high-altitude ME-410, even the jet-powered ME-262. On paper, the jets were faster. In reality, they could never be in the right place when needed. Jet engines of the era were fragile, temperamental machines that demanded long runways, perfect fuel mixtures, and gentle handling, luxuries Germany no longer possessed. The Mosquito, by contrast, needed nothing more than a grassy field and 2 Merlin engines. For civilians, the Mosquito became a psychological weapon more potent than any explosive. Its raids were surgical, rail yards, Gestapo offices, communications hubs, but their symbolic power was immense. In Berlin, rumors spread that the British had built a plane invisible to radar. In occupied Denmark and Norway, the resistance celebrated every sighting as proof that the Allies could strike whenever they wished. The Mosquito's distinctive growl became the sound of inevitability. The RAF understood this and wielded the aircraft without mercy. When heavy bombers attacked German cities at night, Mosquitoes flew ahead to drop incendiaries and flares, marking targets with mathematical precision. After the main waves returned home, Mosquitoes re-entered the ruins to strike headquarters, rescue units, and communications posts. They seemed tireless, everywhere at once. A single Mosquito could force the Luftwaffe to scramble entire groups of fighters, wasting fuel, pilots, and morale for nothing. German high command answered with desperation disguised as planning. New radar systems were rushed into service, and propaganda insisted the Mosquito was overrated, that its speed came at the cost of payload. But the numbers were impossible to hide. In 1944 alone, Mosquito bombers delivered more than 1,900 tons of explosives, losing fewer than 200 aircraft. One British officer joked, "It isn't a bomber, it's a scalpel." By autumn, Göring had grown superstitious. He forbade his staff from mentioning the aircraft by name during briefings, as if silence might banish it. Fighter reports showed exhaustion. Pilots swore they chased ghosts that vanished into cloud. Radar operators logged echoes moving faster than their instruments could track. Ground crews insisted they saw Mosquitoes at impossible altitudes. The legend had outgrown the machine. Dr. Henkel, the same engineer who once carved open a crashed Mosquito, watched it all from his laboratory. He no longer corrected colleagues when they called the plane a phantom. In his private notes, he wrote, "It is not the wood that frightens us. It is the idea that something so light can hold so much force." By the war's final winter, even the mention of the Mosquito could quiet an entire command post in Germany. Reports of sightings arrived with resignation rather than urgency. Everyone understood that by the time the warning appeared, the damage was already done. The Luftwaffe still flew, but its spirit was hollow. To them, the Mosquito had become more than an aircraft. It was inevitability given wings. When the war finally ended in 1945, the Mosquito was already a legend.
It had flown more than 80,000 sorties, photography, bombing, pathfinding, night fighting, while losing so few aircraft that statisticians questioned their own records. In the hangars of post-war Europe, its smooth wooden fuselage looked almost supernatural, too elegant to have been born from war. Germany lay in ruins, its city shredded by the heavy bombers the Mosquito had guided with uncanny accuracy. Yet in the minds of surviving German engineers, it was not the Lancaster or the B-17 that haunted them. It was the wooden ghost that had humbled their science. After the armistice, Allied inspection teams invited German engineers to tour de Havilland's factory at Hatfield. Among them was Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, the man who had once declared the Mosquito's glue a miracle. Now he stood inside the assembly hall, watching craftsmen in overalls polish the curved fuselage halves before bonding them together. The sharp chemical scent of resin filled the air, just as it had in the Rechlin laboratory. Henkel turned to his British escort, a young engineer barely out of university, and asked how many men had designed this process. The Briton smiled. Not many, but thousands built it. That sentence stayed with him for the rest of his life. In his post-war report, Henkel wrote that the Mosquito's true secret was not adhesive or aerodynamics or materials science. It was culture. It was the willingness to let craftsmen and scientists work side by side. Where German factories had been ruled by strict hierarchy and terror of failure, the British had embraced improvisation. A violin maker could teach an engineer about resonance. A chemist could learn from a furniture worker. Out of these collisions of skill and imagination came something no formula could have predicted. The lesson spread far beyond Britain. In the late 1940s, engineers across Europe and America began experimenting with new laminated materials, fiberglass, composite resins, and eventually carbon fiber, all direct descendants of the Mosquito's wooden skin. What had begun as wartime necessity became the foundation of modern aerospace. American designers studied de Havilland's methods closely. Boeing engineers later called the Mosquito the ancestor of every composite airframe we build today. In Britain, its legend grew quietly. The RAF kept Mosquitoes in service well into the 1950s, long after jets dominated the skies. Pilots adored it, its agility, its quiet confidence, its strange, almost organic responsiveness. One veteran told an interviewer, "It felt like the airplane wanted to survive just as much as you did." Museums eventually displayed it as a masterpiece of wartime design, but the people who built it remembered something far simpler.
There was the scent of sawdust in the air, the rhythmic swish of glue brushes, the tapping of piano makers hammering wooden spars together while London trembled under the Blitz. For de Havilland, the Mosquito's success was more than a victory. It was vindication. His impossible idea had not only worked, it had rewritten the very definition of engineering. He once told a reporter, "We weren't trying to overpower the enemy. We were trying to outthink him." Those words would echo through generations of designers who followed. For the German engineers who had tried and failed to recreate the aircraft, the Mosquito became a mirror that exposed their limitations. The Muke prototypes were scrapped after the war. None survived. But in the archives of what would eventually become West Germany's new aviation industry, Henkel's notebooks remained. The final sentence in his wartime journal read, "They proved that imagination, when sharpened by necessity, is stronger than steel." With time, the Mosquitoes shifted from weapon to lesson. It showed the true innovation doesn't always grow from abundance, but often from scarcity, from the willingness to see potential in the ordinary. From plywood and glue had emerged a machine that terrified an empire and redefined the boundaries of possibility. Even today, Historians argue whether the Mosquito was the greatest aircraft of the Second World War. But its achievements speak clearly enough. Faster than any fighter of its era, lighter than any bomber, and more devastating to enemy morale than to enemy armies. Standing beside one in a museum, its skin still glimmering like polished hardwood, you can almost smell the faint trace of resin, the ghost of the glue that once humiliated a superpower. The craftsmen who built it are gone now, their names scattered across forgotten airfields and dusty archives. Yet, their idea lives on. Every time a modern aircraft lifts off on composite wings or a spacecraft launches wrapped in resin and fiber, it carries a fragment of the Mosquito's legacy. They proved that technology doesn't spring from comfort, but from courage. The courage to build what others declare impossible. So the next time you see a photograph of a Mosquito, sleek, smooth, almost silent, remember what it symbolized. Not just British brilliance, not just wartime ingenuity, but the moment when imagination ran faster than fear. If you believe real strength is found in daring to dream beyond logic, comment at 1 below. And if you think the world still underestimates the power of human creativity, leave a like and subscribe for more untold stories, reminders that even wood and glue can change the course of history.